All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us for this great conversation on financial challenges faced by the higher education sector. I'm James Michalowski with the Hunt Institute, and we have a really terrific panel today that we are excited to hear from. Before we jump into the conversation, I'm going to kick things over to the Hunt Institute's President and CEO, Dr. Javed Siddiqui, who's going to give some brief welcoming remarks. Over to you, Javed.
Thank you, James, and thanks to everybody for joining us for our Post-Secondary Pathways webinar series, where we get a chance to hear from leading state policymakers and national resource experts on some of the most pressing higher education issues. Now that the fall semester is underway, and higher education leaders are reflecting on how different this semester looks from previous years, as well as how different their institution's financial situation looks because of the pandemic. We're seeing a tremendous amount of fluctuation and uncertainty with enrollment numbers all over the country. We've come to realize that those institutions that had built out robust online learning structures are thriving. Others are still trying to figure out how to meet their students' needs virtually. Policymakers at all levels should be thinking about how to address the financial challenges faced by higher education sector because of this pandemic, especially when it comes to the costs that fall on students. Having served on the university board, I know it's a big decision to try to pass those costs, how to pass those costs on to students. But unfortunately, that creates a disproportionate impact on especially our most marginalized and low-income communities. So this morning, we're going to hear from experts about how they have thought creatively on how to address certain financial issues faced by schools and students. So I'm looking forward to their thoughts. With that, I'm going to pass it back to you, James, to get our conversation going.
Great. Thanks, Javed. So as Javed mentioned, we're super excited to hear from the guests. Just a couple of quick housekeeping notes from my end before we jump in. We are going to have plenty of time for audience Q&A. We do ask that you submit questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen on the Zoom app. Or if you're on Twitter, you can follow along with today's conversation using the hashtag #PostPathways. And please also feel free to submit questions via Twitter as well. Last brief note is that we are also live streaming on Facebook right now, in case you know of anyone who would prefer to tune in that way. So let's get started. Commissioner Keller, I'd love to start with you, and I wonder if, as kind of an opening response, you could talk a little bit about your role as commissioner and the role that the Texas Higher Ed Coordinating Board plays in the state's landscape, as well as perhaps a few words on how the pandemic has affected your work and the board's work over the last few months.
Thanks, James, and good morning. Thanks for including me in this important discussion. So I've been commissioner now for about a year. I became the commissioner October 1st, but it certainly seems like a lot longer than that now, because this has certainly been a devastating time for our country and for our state. And our Texas higher education institutions, I have to say, have been among those who've been rising to the challenge. So virtually overnight, our faculty reinvented their classes so learning could continue while they shifted their operations to remote. Our institutions also have been partnering closely in state public health responses and by donating equipment, by manufacturing face masks and swabs, and doubling down on the research. So this is the greatest disruption to the operations of our Texas higher education institutions that we've seen since the end of the Second World War, with massive costs and revenue losses for our institutions, and continues to have a serious impact on state revenues. So our role at the Texas Higher Ed Coordinating Board throughout all this, and what continues, is that we act as a facilitator, a partner, and an advocate for our institutions as they're confronting these challenges. So that's in line with one of my primary goals as commissioner, which has been to transition the agency from a more traditional regulatory posture to being able to be a more effective resource for our Texas higher education institutions. So specifically, I'll talk about some of the things that we've been doing. So we are collecting and disseminating information to help institutions navigate the disruptions that have been caused by COVID-19. So that includes developing recommended health protocols, working with our public health officials and our institutions. We've also been working closely with the governor and our legislative leadership and other agencies to provide some regulatory flexibility to help institutions adapt to the current public health emergency and continue to serve their students. We're collaborating very closely with and supporting our public and our independent institutions. So for example, like one of the things we've done is we, through our Texas Higher Education Foundation, we've been working in partnership with state and national philanthropies to launch an emergency aid grant program to support students across our public and private higher ed institutions. And the most significant recent action we've been able to take on behalf of our students and our institutions relates to $175 million of CARES Act funding that we were able to secure for higher education through the governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. So that's going to help tens of thousands of our Texas students continue or restart their progress towards earning a post-secondary credential. And finally, as we're looking beyond this immediate response to recovery, one of our most important roles is to help our higher ed policymakers understand that higher ed is an important part of the solution. So of course, in today's economy, a high-value credential is increasingly essential for anyone who wants to create a better future for themselves and their family. And this pandemic is accelerating changes that we were already seeing in our state and national economy. So I think it's more important than ever that we come together so all of our students, regardless of race, ethnicity, or income, can fully participate in, benefit from, and contribute to the future of Texas. So our higher ed institutions, our students are ready to do that work in partnership with employers, communities, and policymakers, so we can position Texas for an accelerated recovery in a better and more just and more resilient future.
Thanks, Commissioner Keller. Very interesting opening remarks. You touched on a number of things that I think we'll probably return to throughout the conversation. And I think we all know that institutions and higher education students need resources and support now more than ever. So thanks for the steps that you've been taking to support higher education in Texas. Dr. Ellspermann, I'd love to turn to you next and ask if you can speak briefly about Ivy Tech Community College and how you have served students across Indiana and maybe highlight some innovative or creative pivots that the school has had to make because of the pandemic. Dr. Ellspermann, I think you're still on mute.
Thanks for letting me join you today. Let me explain. In Indiana, there is one community college and we're it. We are 18 campuses, almost 150,000 students across the state. So we are the community college. We also are the front door for 42% of all of our students of color start at Ivy Tech. More than 52% of our African-American Hoosiers attend college at Ivy Tech. So we know that in matters of equity, it really matters that we're a place that students can come. So let me tell you just a few things. We went virtual March 20th, not very different than what most institutions did, but knowing we have many of those students who are at risk, even in traditional times, we re-imaged now to date almost 1,500 laptops that we could loan to our students so they would have technology when our campuses weren't open last spring. We redirected Wi-Fi into all of our parking lots. We provided hotspots to faculty. Believe it or not all faculty across the state of Indiana had good internet access. We implemented software like Beyond Trust that allowed us to be using and running equipment in our labs remotely from those students' computers, et cetera. We had to rethink how we would assess students. Remember, many of our students come in the door not quite ready for their programs. So we implemented a brand new knowledge assessment process that now has resulted in the good way, as the commissioner talked about the good outcomes. We had 2/3 more students test into their program using knowledge assessment, a better tool over the tool we had used, AccuPlacer. So a very positive thing in that way. And then on the funding side, yes, we had access to some CARES Act dollars for our students. We also knew that wouldn't deal with all of our students. We had a donor give a significant gift, which we were able to match and raise well over $1 million just for unrestricted, totally unrestricted. Those needs, our students need housing, they've got rent to pay, insecurity and to be able to keep them going. So we'll talk about some other things down the road, but we felt our role was to make sure that our students could continue. And boots on the ground, we know from Strata education research that our community college students are those most at risk of not being able to continue because they are the frontline worker. They do have kids to take care of and other needs. They're working full time, et cetera. It's a tough road. So we've had a lot of learnings and a lot more to do.
Thanks very much. And I think we are all looking forward to learning from you and some of the lessons learned that have developed as you've thought about how to serve students in creative ways during these times. Dr. Garcia, I'd love to turn to you now. And Dr. Elsperman kind of teed up this question nicely, but I wonder if you can just talk about your role at CLASP and the post-secondary education and workforce work that you oversee. And in particular, I know that you and your team have been active on making the case for the need to support students with things like emergency grant aid programs during this time. So could you speak a little bit about your work broadly and also specifically what you've been focusing on in the wake of the pandemic?
Absolutely. And first of all, I just want to thank you for inviting me to participate on this panel. I think this is a very timely discussion, and I'm glad to be here with all of you. So at the Center for Law and Social Policy, I lead the post-secondary education and workforce development team. CLASP is a national anti-poverty organization. We advocate for federal and state policies that increase income security for people with low incomes, particularly people of color, immigrants, and individuals impacted by the criminal justice system. So as you can imagine, we've been very busy since this pandemic and this economic crisis started back in March. In terms of our post-secondary work, we focus on promoting federal and state policies that increase college access and affordability, and obviously supporting completion for students with low incomes, students of color and immigrants in post-secondary education. My team also has a workforce development portfolio, and the focus for that particular bucket of work is really increasing access to good jobs with family sustaining wages and benefits. And we really focus on those job seekers that face the greatest barriers to employment. So there are a few things that I just want to highlight that we've been very busy focusing on. So as you are aware, the pandemic and the economic crisis have really exacerbated and deepened racial inequities that existed before the pandemic. Communities of color have been hit the hardest by COVID-19 and the economic crisis. We are very concerned that Black, Latinx, Latin American communities have been disproportionately affected by the coronavirus. We really believe that this is rooted in systemic racism. And we know that Black, Latinx, and Native American people are disproportionately catching the coronavirus, developing severe illness from COVID-19, and dying from the virus or underlying health conditions. And we also are concerned that Asian American and Pacific Islander individuals are facing xenophobia, discrimination, and mental health impacts. And so, we also are very concerned about the high unemployment rates for people of color, specifically for Black workers, Latinx workers, and Asian American workers. Families are experiencing, students and families are experiencing job losses. They're experiencing loss in income and wages. And I really wanted to highlight this context because it impacts our students who are enrolling in our institutions of higher education. And it's very important that as we think about the financial challenges that institutions are facing, we really center students of color and families of color and be as responsible as possible to their basic needs, and also just have take a really proactive approach and a holistic approach to addressing their particular concerns at this time. Also want to note that historically under-resourced institutions such as community colleges, such as HBCUs and MSIs, we're concerned that they are experiencing some adverse impacts given the climate that we find ourselves in. So just sort of in summing this up, I just want to highlight that students of color make up more than 45% of post-secondary education students. And the stakes are really high right now for families of color in terms of their health, their basic needs, their ability to access a good job, to have a steady income, to be able to feed their families. So it's critical that our higher education systems and our colleges and universities really center racial and economic justice. And the final point I'd like to make is that we've been very busy trying to urge Congress to pass a COVID-19 relief package to address many of these hardships that are impacting families, students, institutions, and state and local governments at this time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Extremely helpful. Opening remarks and context to keep in mind. I think it's extremely important that we keep equity gaps front and center as we think about not only the short-term response to this pandemic to make sure students of color and others don't fall through the cracks, but also as we think longer term about opportunities to rethink some of our higher education systems in ways that produce more equitable outcomes for all. So definitely appreciate that framing. And your last point is a perfect segue into the first question that I wanted to ask to Commissioner Keller. Commissioner, I know you mentioned the CARES Act funding investment that was made in Texas higher education to shore up need-based financial aid programs and to help support displaced workers seeking to re- or upscale. Can you say why it was so important to make that investment in Texas's higher education sector at this time? And kind of to Dr. Garcia's last point, the second part of my question to you is, does that initial investment of CARES Act funding address the scope of need that institutions and students in Texas are facing right now?
Yeah, thanks. Now, the CARES Act funds have been very helpful to our institutions and to our students. So our Texas higher education institutions directly received about $1.1 billion from the CARES Act. And that's a lot of money, even for Texas, but it was spread across 294 public, independent, and for-profit institutions, and more than 1.6 million students in Texas higher education. So that funding was released in two equal parts. There was one half that is dedicated to emergency financial aid for students, and then the other half to help cover additional institutional costs like institutional refunds made to students. Some other institutional costs. I know many presidents have also used those funds to buy laptops and hotspots and even provide additional emergency aid to students. So it's, on one hand, while that federal funding has been very important to help meet some of the most immediate needs, it doesn't begin to cover the institution's full costs and lost revenue for spring, summer, and fall 2020. So we're certainly hoping that Congress can come together on a more significant round of stimulus funding for higher education. I would argue that that ought to be distributed through the states as opposed to directly to institutions for the department, so we can make sure that it's aligned with our state policy priorities. But of course, right now, all this is highly uncertain. Now, what I alluded to earlier is that while it's important to acknowledge the severity of the immediate crisis our institutions are facing, In Texas, we've also begun a discussion about the special roles and responsibilities that higher education is going to have in driving economic recovery. So that's an important focus of our work, especially leading up to the legislative session that'll convene this next January. So, so again, as we're looking beyond response to recovery, I think we can't emphasize enough that in today's economy, jobs follow skills. That we've all seen the work from Georgetown that showed us that nearly all the net new jobs that were created in the United States in the wake of the Great Recession required at least some post-secondary education. And in Texas, more than 85% of the new jobs that were created in the wake of the Great Recession required at least some post-secondary education. And that was when we had incredibly robust energy and service sectors. So we also know that high quality post-secondary credentials are the best long-term insurance policy against long-term unemployment. So right now the unemployment rates for workers with just high school diplomas or some college and no credential are more than twice the rate of workers with bachelor's degrees. So the traditional playbook in Texas, like in other states, has been that when the state budget gets tight, then the state tends to pull back, and then tuition tends to go up, and that means student debt goes up. So especially right now, that could slow down economic recovery, because we know in Texas that we have hundreds of thousands of people who are going to need to reskill and upskill to be able to get back on their feet, get back into the economy, and help drive the Texas recovery. So what we've been working on is to say, if we could move quickly to help people reskill, upskill, and keep our students on track to completing high value credentials, then maybe we could accelerate the Texas recovery and even come out of this crisis with a higher skilled and more resilient workforce in the future. So it's an important first step, certainly not meeting the scope of the needs we have, but it was an important first step. Governor Abbott and the legislative leadership came together to commit $175 million of the discretionary governor's emergency education relief funds to higher education to help maintain the state's need-based financial aid programs and to keep more students enrolled at colleges and universities. So the majority of that funding, about $150 million, is providing financial aid support for students. That includes some emergency aid for students who are suddenly at risk of leaving higher education or forgoing higher education. What I've been hearing from a lot of presidents is they're seeing more students having trouble paying their bills right now. So we've provided some targeted funding to help fill those gaps. We know a lot of families are suffering. And so that estimated family contribution that may have looked like a stretch a few months ago now looks impossible. And so then on top of that, there's a portion of the funding. We're starting out with about $46.5 million that's dedicated to support displaced workers who might need to reskill and upskill to get back into the workforce, or folks who are in the workforce, but they're going to need to reskill or upskill to be able to advance. So, so that funding is going to flow directly through the institutions to provide some quick, tangible support to help keep students enrolled and help them re-enroll, even in this time where they're experiencing incredible financial distress. I'll highlight just a couple of other things that we're doing that I think are going to provide important infrastructure for the long term. So from those remaining GEAR funds from the CARES Act, Governor Abbott approved $15 million to our agency to improve the state's educational and workforce data infrastructure so we can better inform and support our students and families. So that includes some funding for new interactive advising tools so students can help identify programs and financial aid opportunities, and we can hand off the students to the institutions. Our agency is the steward of all of the state's combined K-12 and workforce data. So we have unbelievable data in Texas. We just haven't done a great job of making that data accessible and useful. So now we're going to be deploying new tools so we can turn that data into actionable intelligence for students and families, for institutions and our policymakers. And then last, the governor approved $10 million for significantly improving the quality of online instruction and reducing costs of instructional materials to students, especially in the courses that most students take. So those funds are going to be used to support faculty innovators and their campus support teams in creating and improving more open educational resources around frequently transferred core courses, college readiness materials, and also workforce education materials. So to be sure, I'm sure a lot of folks listening today have been through a lot of different iterations, and we've learned a lot of hard lessons about how we support digital learning, how we develop digital courseware. So we can't be cavalier about this, but there's an important opportunity, as Sue mentioned, to build on lessons we've learned, to get behind those institutional and the faculty innovators, improve cross-institutional collaborations, and better support our students, our faculty, and our institutions.
Thanks, Commissioner, for highlighting all of that terrific work happening in Texas. And I think you also raised an excellent point about kind of the catch-22 of this moment, being that institutions and students face these great financial needs, and yet things like high-quality certificates and degrees are more important than ever as we think about economic recovery. So that sort of case-making is especially important at this time, and we appreciate you highlighting it. Dr. Ellspermann, next question over to you. Could you please talk a little bit about kind of the before and after of how Ivy Tech has thought about serving students? What systems had you put in place before the pandemic to provide some flexibility to the students that you serve? And how have those systems been especially beneficial or expanded, or how have you kind of leaned on some of those changes that you had previously made now that we're in a place of distance or hybrid learning? Sorry, Dr. Ellspermann, I think you're on mute.
And I did it again, but I want to affirm what Commissioner Keller shared about the changes that we need to make in higher education. And Ivy Tech already was one of the nation's largest providers of online education before the pandemic. The secret, which is not really a secret because as Commissioner Keller alluded, we know there are issues in our online education quality, that not all faculty are as skilled in that modality, that our technology is not there, that sometimes we don't provide enough support, et cetera. So a year and a half ago, we started redesigning our online education with the goal to eliminate the gap between a face-to-face course pass rate and an online course. Thank goodness, because now that we've taken 6 or 7% out of that gap down to a very small amount now, we're able to take those and the investments in our ed tech resources. So having people who can help those faculty redesign, making sure that our best faculty members are teaching those courses and that we've skilled them up and provided all that they need in order to do that, and taking the barriers out of the way. When we did that, we centralized our online across the state and we gained a lot of efficiencies, which opened up more resources to invest in our faculty and in our training, so that when we went virtual in March, it was seamless. All of our faculty are adept at either online or virtual, and we had a few more investments to make in some technology, but we were ready to go. We're right now, as we come into fall, we're using various modalities, but we're about a third that have some face-to-face component in them now. Many of those are labs that require it. Others are blended, where they're getting just what they need from the in-person time with faculty. Another third virtual and another third online. So that opened the door to a second project we were working on before coming into the pandemic, which, as Dr. Garcia will appreciate, are single moms, right? Who working, having children, trying to get in school. They needed additional flexibility. So we had designed something called Learn Anywhere. It was a way that every week that single mom could decide if she was going to come on campus, if she wanted to be virtual or she wanted to be online on that same course, every week getting to decide. We decided to move that project and scale it across the college. So we have between 400 and 500 sections running right now, faculty volunteering to teach those 3 modalities at the same time. And we think that's one of the many positives that are going to come out of this time. of meeting our students where they are, because we have the most at-risk students, as Dr. Garcia described. We have to meet them where they are. So that ability to do the blended at the highest level, the Learn Anywhere model, has been a really, really positive one. And we will continue to adjust as time goes on. The third thing I'll mention is one of the things we did with our institutional dollars. Thankfully, we didn't have dorms, that we don't have residential life. So we didn't have some of the challenges that the four-year institutions had. So we actually took $5 million of our institutional CARES Act dollars to purchase a college-wide subscription to Cengage Unlimited and offer it free to our students. So I can tell you right now, this fall, we have a lot of happy community college students who are saving on average about $140 this fall, because they're able to have access to the entire library. We're going to do that throughout the year. If those CARES Act dollars get extended, we'll do it for another year. But like OER, this is a way we know we're moving towards inclusive tuition as a college. Our students don't have the bandwidth, the financial wherewithal to buy materials. And we know community college students, the statistic is about a quarter of them will never buy their materials. They can't afford them. So we're trying to find innovative ways, and Cengage, along with other publishers who are now interested in trying that with us, we're looking at ways to ensure that our students can succeed given the circumstances that they have. So those are three good examples.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Those are excellent examples, and we appreciate you sharing them. And I know a lot of attendees probably found those especially interesting and maybe thinking about how to replicate or scale them in their schools or communities. And it also provides a great segue into Dr. Garcia, the question I wanted to ask you, which is kind of generally whether you can talk a little bit more about something that you raised that's come up in a couple of points in this discussion, which is the full range of costs faced by today's higher education students, including things like materials that Dr. Esperman mentioned, including childcare costs and healthcare costs and transportation costs and housing costs. Can you talk about your work around helping policymakers understand that full scope of needs that students face, and in particular, how that's become even more important as a lot of these costs associated with higher education become even more difficult for students, especially students from communities of color who have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic?
Sure. As you all know, this is an unprecedented health and economic crisis, and it's imperative that policymakers recognize the urgency and the financial circumstances and challenges that students and families of color and families with low income and immigrant students are facing at this time, as well as the institutions that they are enrolled in. To your point, James, it's important for federal policymakers to understand the needs of non-traditional students as well. So I'm referring to parenting students who might need childcare. You may have other students that really have experienced a crisis in their family, students who find themselves homeless. There are other students, for example, immigrant students who are not eligible for emergency aid, and that's an issue that we have been really advocating for. These families are facing incredible hardships during this time. Millions of immigrant families have not benefited from any of the COVID-19 packages that Congress has passed. So it's important to look at all of the students that are enrolling on your campuses and to really take a holistic approach in really trying to meet both their basic needs, to address any type of housing, food insecurity, any needs regarding their health care, costs. So basic any additional costs that they may be experiencing that are really connected to this, all of the many disruptions and challenges that they are facing in their lives. So it's really important to take into account all of the needs that our students are facing at this time, especially those students who are experiencing the greatest challenges in post-secondary education and in our communities currently.
Thank you so much, Dr. Garcia. That's a great segue into the audience Q&A portion of the webinar, which we will move into now. And we've got some terrific questions. Apologies that we probably will not be able to get to all of them. Please do submit any additional questions using that Q&A feature. But Dr. Garcia, we just received a question that kind of builds on what you were just talking about. So I'll go back to you first, if you don't mind. Nakia Sims from the Baylor College of Medicine asked a question specifically about how to support students who are aging out of foster care and may need wraparound support services, such as housing and application assistance. And she also asked about supporting students who are at risk of housing insecurity or who maybe don't have health insurance. Dr. Garcia, can you say a little bit more about policies to help specifically those groups of students?
Well, I think it's very important on your particular campuses to have a system for ensuring that those students understand that emergency aid is available to them. Some students do not always open their official email, so it's important to be in constant contact with students who are experiencing the greatest difficulties, to connect them to public benefit programs, to also connect them to resources in their communities is very important. So I think colleges need to have some very strong relationships with local government, with state agencies that can help these students and provide other public benefits that they might be eligible for. But I also think just on your own campuses, it's critical, even in this online environment, financial aid counseling is important. Mental health services, providing students with mental health services is even more important now than ever. And ensuring that those students can actually connect to a member of your staff that can walk them through any types of documentation or financial or applications that they need to fill out, and to really be proactive about providing as much support to these students as possible.
Thanks very much, Dr. Garcia. I want to turn to the other questions in the queue here because we have so many great ones. This one is from Loretta Goodwin from the American Youth Policy Forum. And Loretta asks about the fact that online learning has become such a dominant course delivery method in higher education today. And she talks a little bit about the perception that online instruction may be inferior and that therefore students and families should expect to pay less for online higher education course delivery. How can leaders in higher education be thinking about ways to address this perception and to ensure quality in remote delivery? I think we'll start with Dr. Elsperman to respond to this question, and then would invite Commissioner Keller and Dr. Garcia to weigh in as well.
Sure. Well, I would say our goal, as I shared at Ivy Tech, is there shouldn't be a difference in delivery. Our faculty need to be adept, and we need to invest to make sure that they have the tools and the skills to teach in that modality. And at Ivy Tech, we did that. One of the questions they asked, well, how did you fund that? It turns out when you consolidate courses, we had 18 campuses often offering an online course with 5 or 6 or 10 people in it, as opposed, and another campus offering the same course with 12 people in it. When we were able to consolidate and make those relatively full courses of 25 to 30 students, we had the money to invest in the technology, the additional ed tech individuals, the resources, and the training. So I don't think I buy that. But secondly, we regularly look at our pass rates on our third-party certifying tests, whether that's an NCLEX for nursing students, which obviously don't do a lot online, but other programs that have a significant online component and look at a external test or exam, if you will, to see where those are. And we watch pass rates, drop rates, and the feedback of students to ensure that we are seeing the same kind of quality, and that's just something we normally track. Now, the cost of it, if you've made the investments, it's been traditional that there have been technology fees associated with online courses over time, because there is an investment that institutions make in order to provide the quality of online. So I don't know that I see discounting to be expected, but I certainly see online's here to stay. It's not going to be 100%. And in fact, I think you're going to see ever more of the blended models, which is what we're striving to do with our community college students. We know there are courses and times that students need to be in person in a lab or with a faculty member or in a group experience that needs to be that way. We need, our responsibility as higher education leaders is to help ensure that we're meeting those students where they are with the best modality. For many working Americans, single parents, et cetera, online is a critical part of that modality. It's that or nothing. So we want to make sure that we're giving them a high value in whichever modality they use. And that, I think, should be the commitment of all higher education.
Thanks, Dr. Elspermann. Commissioner Killer, anything to add on this question?
Yeah, so a couple of points. So, I think the timing of the pandemic, in some ways, we were poorly equipped at a number of institutions and university systems, because what we've seen happen over the last decade is a number of presidents, chief academic officers have started to see their teaching centers and their digital learning support centers really mostly as cost centers. And so they've pulled back their investments in those support structures. And so then what happened in March is you had these campus support centers that had been supporting several dozen or even maybe 200 or 300 online courses suddenly have to support 3,000 courses. And so we didn't have nearly enough instructional designers, course builders, and we haven't had the pipeline in place to develop the talent that we need. And so in this immediate disruption, I need to say let's just stipulate there's an important distinction between emergency online instruction and high quality digital learning. And so as everybody was racing to put their courses online, then the students were sometimes complaining about quality, and faculty are having to learn technologies and new modalities that are unfamiliar. And I can tell you what we're seeing in my house with my kids right now upstairs is a whole lot of Zoom lectures and that kind of thing that we know are not effective. Now, at the same time, what we're seeing and what I'm hearing from colleagues across the state and across the country that I think speaks to Sue's point is that we have now individual faculty, departments, even whole institutions that had mostly opted out of doing very much with digital learning. And now all of this creative energy has been channeled in a new direction. And so what I'm hearing from faculty colleagues and higher education leaders across the state and beyond is they feel like we're just at the front edge of this and we're not going back. So there's a lot of really beautiful, creative, exciting things that are happening as folks are using new tools, are realizing the potential of that, also engaging students in new ways in the design of their learning. and we're shifting away from the restrictions that were imposed by our physical spaces and traditional agrarian calendars and that kind of thing. So I think that this really is a important watershed, and we'll look back on this as the year that everything changed in the ways that we were thinking about digital learning, technology enhanced learning. Now, what we want to support and encourage, first of all, is get behind those local innovators. And so I'd mentioned before, you know, where we're securing resources and supporting those campuses and individual innovators. But the real game changer, I think, is going to come through those cross-institutional collaborations and building more robust facilitated networks of faculty innovators, so that we can move faster, so that we can learn a lot more about what's more or less effective, and remove some of the redundancies that we've seen, where you know, you go to these digital learning meetings and everybody's spending millions of dollars working on the same problems, recreating the same materials, and overall we're not learning very much about how students learn and what's more effective. So this is a moment, hopefully, where we can move past that and we can blaze some new trails. And that's very exciting for faculty. It's very exciting for students.
Thank you, Commissioner. And also reminds me of a point you made earlier about the importance of collecting and making available good data. You know, we need some of that information on which remote instruction delivery methods are most effective and how they affect student learning, and hopefully that can inform some of the exciting innovations going forward. Dr. Garcia, I would invite you to have a brief response to this question, but there is also one last question that I'd like to try and squeeze in before our closing statement. So, Dr. Garcia, anything quickly on this, or should I move to the final question?
Sure, just that online learning needs to be of the highest quality. And I think for students of color, first generation students, and students who might have, who have left college and they're returning to college after being in the workforce for several years, I think it's very important for these students to have access to faculty, to have access to critical supports like tutoring, like counseling, and to really to be able to access office hours and the courses that they need to graduate. So I really just want to emphasize the equity piece in this, and for us not to forget that there are underprepared students that really need to speak to, you know, really need extra assistance in order to succeed in school.
Thank you. Excellent points and very helpful context. So one last question before we go to closing statements, and I'd like to do kind of a rapid response and get the three of you to weigh in as briefly as possible. We have this question from Shantae Riskaner, who is from Northeast Lakeview College. And the question is about how in particular to support veteran students during this time, and whether you have particular thoughts on how policies that are being developed to support students in the wake of the pandemic can incorporate the needs of veteran students who often have to do online learning because of their deployment, or often need things such as prior learning assessments in order to get a head start on their college journeys. So quick responses on supporting veteran students. We'll do Dr. Ellspermann, then Commissioner Keller, then Dr. Garcia.
Well, I think we are all privileged to get to support veteran students and want to make that journey on them. Of course, we all on every campus has a veteran service officer, so they're there to be that wraparound support, first point of contact. As Dr. Garcia talked about, every college campus should have some form of wraparound services in general. We call it Ivy Cares at Ivy Tech, where there is someone who can help navigate in addition to the veteran affairs person. And I think having the option of, if you're deployed, certainly virtual advising, virtual tutoring. We use tutor.com, which is our online tutor. That's a national platform that all colleges could buy into to use in addition to their other means. And I think we just have to be, as in community college, we bring in many people to our door that don't look like a traditional 18-year-old college student, right? We're not. We're almost all non-traditional. So we know that whether it is making sure that any limitations or challenges they have, we are able to overcome those with disability support services or whatever other services. We just have to remain committed to do those things and to reach out sufficiently to know that those individuals are welcome in our doors and will have the support they need to succeed.
Thanks. Over to you, Commissioner.
So first, I just want to applaud Ivy Tech's work in this area, and then I'll say also in Texas, we have a number of colleges. Central Texas College is a leader in providing high quality online courses to veterans, and we have many Texas institutions that are held up as national examples of how we support veterans. And of course, we have a large veteran community here in Texas. I want to pick up on one particular point that Sue made in passing that I think is so important around the digital advising piece, because one of the things that I myself am a veteran, and that I've heard from colleagues who are still serving and are veterans, and also from higher education, is a lot of concern about that unevenness in access to advising. I think one of the most important things that we can do is help veterans understand here are the kinds of opportunities that are available to you, here are the kind of resources you can tap into, here are the kind of career paths that you can tap into. So they get a lot of aggressive marketing sometimes, where folks are pitching them on lots of different kinds of programs, but we want to help make sure that those veterans are going to be able to make the best possible decisions for them about the programs they take, about the courses they take, about how that can fit into earning a high quality post-secondary credential and set them up for the best possible career path. So that's certainly one of the important applications of the kind of virtual advising infrastructure that we envision in Texas. And this is an area where our agency is taking the lead with working in close partnership with the Texas Education Agency and the Texas Workforce Commission. Is we need to make sure that veterans and also our traditional students, our adult students across the state can access high quality, interactive, accurate advising resources.
Thanks so much, Commissioner. Dr. Garcia, any brief thoughts on supporting veteran students?
I agree with the other panelists on the critical role of advising. That's extremely important for veterans in terms of knowing what the expectations are when they're pursuing a particular major. We also really encourage the use of prior learning assessments. So to the extent that veterans are aware that that is an option for them, prior learning assessments are a way to really help students get to the finish line and to graduate. And so that's a strategy we encourage institutions to use as well.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. So with the about 6 minutes that we have left, I'd love to invite the three of you to give some brief closing remarks, and we could probably spend another hour on this question. So I do appreciate you keeping it relatively high level, but just in general, what are you optimistic about in terms of the medium and long-term horizon for higher education in terms of opportunities to reimagine some parts of how we do higher education in this country, and how we might be able to produce more equitable outcomes for all students? So I'll start with Commissioner Keller on this one, then to Dr. Ellspermann, and then to Dr. Garcia.
So first, James, and the other panelists, thanks for the conversation today. I really appreciate the timely discussion. So when I think about what I'm especially optimistic about, I do think there's a growing awareness of that special role and responsibility that higher education is going to need to play in driving economic recovery and expanding opportunities. So higher education isn't like a lot of other areas in state budgets. It's not just a cost center, because there's a return on these investments for individuals, for communities, and for our states and for our nation. And I think there's growing awareness among policymakers, and certainly when I talk with folks who work on economic development, that we're going to have to educate more people to higher standards than we've ever done before, so that we can ensure that everyone, regardless of their geography, regardless of their race and ethnicity, has the opportunity to participate in, to contribute to, and benefit from our great state and our great nation. I think that's exciting. I think we've touched on a number of other important points around digital learning, and we're just on the front edge of this, but there's a lot of promise that it holds. I'll say that now one of the important challenges we're going to need to come together and navigate is that the ways that we fund and hold accountable our institutions, the ways we think about accreditation, they've baked into them assumptions about traditional modes of delivery. And so to really realize the kind of potential that we've talked about around digital learning and new modes of delivery, I think we need to create more room for innovation for our faculty, for our institutions, so we can accelerate the pace of innovation and we can accelerate our recovery for individuals, our states, and our nation.
Thanks, Commissioner. Dr. Ellspermann, over to you. What are you optimistic about?
I will build on what the commissioner said, that I think the genie is out of the bottle, in the sense that we can think about instruction in different ways and figure out modalities and blended modalities that will be to the benefit of what is now nationwide more non-traditional students than traditional age students. And we need to do that, and we need to do that with equity. And I believe the technology is on our side to help reach some populations that would have had great difficulty prior. We can take some barriers out of the way. You don't have to show up on campus at 6:30 p.m. 2 nights a week in order to get that degree part-time while you're working and raising a family, right? I think that and our faculty, and I will say this to a compliment at least of Ivy Tech faculty, and I think nationwide, they have leaned into this in a positive way. And as they've done that, many have discovered that there's parts of this they really like, and they see the potential, and they will bring that back into even their traditional classroom. So I think that's a very positive part of all of this. And I think the second thing the commissioner alluded to earlier, credentials that we have traditionally valued, that 4-year degree, are not the only credentials of value. The shorter term certifications have extremely high value, especially in fields like information technology. And we need to also lean into that and think differently about how we fund, what can we provide financial aid to, et cetera, and understand that it is the skill and that quality of learning that the employer is looking for, not just a degree in hand. And I think this time will just reinforce that.
Thanks very much, Dr. Ellspermann. Lastly, over to you, Dr. Garcia, for some closing thoughts on what you're optimistic about.
Sure, there are a couple of areas that I'm really optimistic about. So nationally, there's been a lot of discussion about reimagining a federal-state partnership and what that might look like. There's been conversations about, bold investments in community colleges and open access institutions, and increasing the purchasing power of the federal Pell Grant, and canceling student loan debt in debt-free college. And all of these are types of strategies that would really support students with low incomes and students of color. So I'm optimistic about this idea of a new federal partnership. I'm also optimistic about the conversations that have been happening around the country around centering racial and economic justice on college campuses and in higher education systems. I think that that conversation is long overdue, and I'm excited about the prospect of seeing what the future holds for students of color who are now over 45% of our higher education system, and how these conversations can lead to more equitable outcomes for them and for immigrant families and in the future, and how that really can help to close equity gaps and also close gaps with regard to wealth, the wealth inequality that exists in this country.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Garcia, and thanks to all of our speakers today. This was a really fantastic conversation. I have a lot to think about. I know that our attendees do as well. We so appreciate you taking the time to join us this morning. I'm just going to end by letting you know about some additional programming that we have coming up at the Hunt Institute next week. On Tuesday of next week, we've got the latest installment in our Race and Education webinar series. It will be on confronting implicit discrimination in schools and school districts. And the registration link for that webinar should be popping up in the chat right now if you want to go ahead and sign up for that before you leave. And on Thursday of next week, we're having another Supporting Innovation in Education webinar that will focus on helping educators provide high quality remote instruction. And as always, please do remember that at the Hunt Institute, we have a COVID-19 landing page with a lot of resources that are helpful for policymakers on a range of different topics. That's it for us. Thank you so much for joining today. And we hope to see you on a Hunt Institute webinar sometime soon.